Welcome to Miyconst Hardware. Quite often I'm getting multiple different questions asking me which platform is the best to use for a budget gaming computer. Many people are asking me about X79 and asking me, can you please review or suggest me the best X79 motherboard, because E5-2689 or E5-2650 V2 are very cheap, DDR3 is very cheap, and this platform seems to be very decent. In particular, many people were asking me what I think about E5-2689, the first version, which is working with the X79 platform, and if it's a good combination with the cheap Chinese X79 motherboard and DDR3 version in comparison to E5-2620 V3 and X99 platform. So, in this video I am going to answer those questions and explain why I think that X79 platform is only for ultra-budget gaming or non-gaming computers, and if you have at least semi-decent budget, you shall go for X79 LGA 2011 version 3. For this comparison, I have picked 3 the most popular CPUs which would be used for a budget gaming computer. Starting with the Xeon E5-2620 V3, it's a 6-core CPU with 12 threads. It's limited to DDR4 1866, but with the Turbo Boost unlock we can force the CPU to work at 3.2 GHz on all 6 cores. So in games, regardless of game and regardless of the CPU load, the CPU stays at 3.2 GHz on all 6 cores, which is very decent. Even limited to DDR4 1866, the CPU delivers very good performance for its price. In my test, the CPU was tested with undervolting with -70 mV offset for the CPU and -50 mV offset for the CPU cache or integrated memory controller. The second CPU I was asked about is E5-2630L V3. The CPU has 8 cores, 16 threads, but it's limited to 2.9 GHz. With Turbo Boost unlock, this CPU is not able to hold 2.9 GHz. In my case, I'm testing the CPU with -90-50 mV offset, and still the CPU is going down to 2.8 GHz in games. So, the CPU will be working on all 8 cores, depending on the load, 2.8-2.9 GHz speed, which is kinda bad, but also not that bad when you have 8 physical cores. And the last tested CPU is X79 option, Xeon E5-2690. This CPU has very similar technical specification to E5-2689. Thus, whatever I tell about 2690 or show in this video is also applicable to E5-2689. These CPUs also have very similar gaming performance to E5-2650 V2. Actually, I have bought myself E5-2650 V2, but unfortunately the CPU I have received has one defective memory channel. The CPU works only in a 3-channel configuration, and if I'm gonna do some tests and benchmarks, I need a properly functioning CPU. I cannot compare CPUs when one is working with just 3 channels memory configuration and others are working with a fully enabled 4 channels memory configuration. Xeon E5-2620 and 2630L V3 CPUs were as always tested with my 100G X99 TF motherboard, but E5-2690 was tested with this Machinist X79 motherboard. This motherboard is available under different names and different brands on AliExpress. Machinist has only added the heat sink on the VRAM and the chipset. Now let's take a quick look at Machinist X79 version 2.82. Here you can see the version number, and if you decide to buy this motherboard, regardless of what I'm going to show and tell in this video, then please be careful and look at the version number, because there are many different other motherboards which look almost the same, but they have different set of features, and you might be missing on quad-channel memory configuration, and you might be missing USB 3 ports, or there might be some other issues. On this motherboard we have socket LGA 2011 version 0 or version 1. You can call it whatever, but it's the one which was before LGA 2011 version 3. The motherboard supports Intel Xeon E5 version 0 and version 2 CPUs, as well as Core i7 CPUs. Memory configuration is 4 memory slots DDR3, and the memory system is quad-channel. Here you will find a single PCI Express X16 slot for graphical cards, and here is one PCI Express X1 for the expansion cards. Additionally, here is an M.2 slot which supports both SATA and NVMe SSD drives. But it's important to mention that the previous versions of these motherboards did not have SATA support and did not have those jumpers to switch on and off SATA support for the M.2 slot. Thus, if you would like to use a modified BIOS from the Kupidyosheva YouTube channel or from some other place, which was based on the original BIOS for this motherboard, SATA support for the M.2 SSD drives will be lost. Here you will see 3 SATA 2 ports, 1 SATA 3 port. Here you will get USB 3.0 for the front panel, USB 2.0 for the front panel, front audio, 3-pin fan connector, and here is one more 3-pin fan connector. These are buttons and LEDs for the front panel. 4-pin fan connector, this one is for the CPU cooler. This 4-pin fan connector can also adjust the rotation speed of your CPU fan according to the CPU temperature. Here is the 24-pin power connector for the motherboard and 8-pin power connector for the CPU. On the back side of the motherboard, you will also find everything you would expect to have with a budget X79 motherboard: 2 PS2 ports, 2 USB 3 ports, 4 USB 2 ports, Ethernet port, and a very simple audio output. So it seems like a very decent M80X X79 motherboard, which packs all the necessary features for a budget gaming computer. The motherboard comes with all the standard Chinese motherboard issues, such as non-working sleep mode and non-working temperature sensors on the motherboard. The USB 3.0 ports, they are actually working properly fine, but the speed is lower than expected. The original stock BIOS unfortunately does not have memory timings adjustments, and the maximum memory speed is DDR3-1866. With the modified BIOS from the Kupidyosheva YouTube channel, you can adjust memory timings and increase your memory speed to DDR3-2133. Of course, you will need a very good DDR3 memory modules which would work at that frequency, but it's possible to do with the modified BIOS. With that modified BIOS, it will not be possible to install SATA SSD drives into the M.2 slot. Additionally, I can mention that when I tried to flash BIOS for this motherboard from Windows using FPT or AFO-Win, the motherboard got bricked and I had to restore the motherboard functionality using my external USB flash drive. Sadly, the motherboard BIOS is located over here, which is very inconvenient because these capacitors are blocking access to the BIOS, and it was extremely annoying to get my clip onto the chip to be able to restore the motherboard state. It's also needed to connect the 24-pin power from the power supply and supply the current from this connector to be able to read and write this BIOS using my CH341A USB flash programmer. Maybe with some better programmers it will work without this power connector, but in my case it was required. Let's go back to the tested CPUs. To make this video a bit more interesting and a bit more informative, I'm also going to add Ryzen 5 5600X results. Unfortunately, I still did not have an opportunity and enough time to retest my Ryzen 5 5600X with all the latest games and latest updates for the system and games and drivers. Thus, the Ryzen 5 5600X results are slightly outdated, and if I would retest the CPU, most likely the scores would be slightly higher, because comparing the test results for my Xeon CPUs with and without updates to games, Windows and drivers, I can see that the performance has improved. Even though Ryzen 5 5600X results are slightly outdated and probably slightly lower than they are going to be right now, it's still nice to have these values in the common graphs. All technical specification about my test setup and everything tested will be available in the technical slides by the end of this video, but I have to tell you that I have made a slight mistake when I was testing E5-2630L V3. For some reason, I believe that this CPU is able to work with the DDR4-2133. That's why when I was testing games, I have applied memory timings for my memory sticks for DDR4-2133. And after I have finished testing all the games, I have realized that, oops, the CPU is only working with the DDR4-1866. Thus, E5-2620 V3 had slightly better memory timings when comparing to E5-2630L V3 in this video. Nevertheless, the difference is very negligible, because the difference only touches the sub-timings and the memory timings were almost identical. In both cases, it was DDR4-1866 CL10. I would really love to do the testing with identical timings, but I simply don't have time and power to retest all 18 games with the DDR4-1866 and correct timings using my E5-2630L V3. So I'm sorry about this mistake, but the results are still good enough to compare them and take a look at them. In this video, I'm not going to go through every tested game. Instead, I'm going to pick 8 different games and show you a side-by-side comparison between 3 of these CPUs. So you can see with your eyes E5-2620, E5-2630L V3 and E5-2690 what kind of FPS you can get with these CPUs, what are the CPU temperatures, what are the CPU frequencies, and how much power these CPUs consume. I hope this is gonna be interesting, but first let's take a look at Cinebench R15, R20 and R23 to compare raw performance of those 3 CPUs using this synthetic benchmark. Testing single-core performance, E5-2620 V3 beats E5-2690 in Cinebench R20 and R33. This is probably because these 2 benchmarks are using the new modern instructions and E5-2690 simply doesn't have those. In the old Cinebench R15, E5-2690, which has slightly higher CPU clock frequency, comes on top. E5-2630L V3 in R20 and R23 shows very similar results to a much higher clocked E5-2690. In Cinebench R15, with 2.9 GHz single-core turbo, it loses to E5-2690. Switching to multi-core results, we can see that E5-2690 is able to take a win in all 3 tests. Here, E5-2620, which has only 6 cores, cannot compete with 8-core CPUs. Still, it's nice to see how the gap between E5-2630L V3 and E5-2690 is very minimal. 8 cores of E5-2630L V3 at 2.8–2.9 GHz with turbo boost unlock deliver about the same performance as 8 core of E5-2690 at 3.3–3.4 GHz. As usual, let's start with Battlefield 5. Here, all 3 CPUs are delivering quite similar performance, but much to my surprise, E5-2630L V3 has the best average FPS. 122 FPS on average, and 1% low mark stays at 55 frames per second. E5-2620 V3 is very close by, 117 FPS on average, and 58 FPS 1% low. E5-2690, which has 8 CPU cores and the highest CPU frequency out of all of these CPUs, is delivering only 101 FPS on average. With such performance, it's also able to consume twice as much electricity as E5-2630L V3. Far Cry New Dawn. This game really likes strong single-core performance. Nevertheless, E5-2630L V3 is able to stand neck and neck to E5-2620 V3. 52 and 72 FPS for E5-2630L V3 and 54–75 FPS for E5-2620 V3. E5-2690, which has the highest CPU clock frequency, delivers the worst performance once again, only 47 and 67 FPS by minimal and average FPS values. Assassin's Creed Valhalla. It's a fairly new and well-optimized game which is utilizing DirectX 12 API. Here, all of the CPUs are delivering very similar performance, still E5-2620 is on the first place and E5-2690 takes the last place. 2690 delivers 33 and 105 FPS, while 2620 V3 gives 39 and 118 FPS. The difference between these 2 CPUs by average FPS is more than 10 FPS. It's kinda significant, especially if you keep in mind that E5-2690 has 2 extra CPU cores and consumes almost twice as much electricity compared to E5-2620 V3. F1 2019. This game also loves single-core performance, still E5-2620 V3 is not able to pull ahead from E5-2630L V3. 2630L V3 gives 123 and 173 FPS, while E5-2620 V3 delivers a bit better performance, 124 and 175 FPS. E5-2690 is again taking the last spot, only 114 and 166 FPS. And once again, the CPU consumes twice as much power when compared to the V3 competitors. Again and again, we can see that optimized and not optimized games, fast-paced and low-paced games are playing better with E5-2620 and 2630L V3. Shadow of the Tomb Raider. This is a rather well-optimized but also very demanding game. It is able to use multiple CPU cores. Here, all of the 3 CPUs are delivering almost identical performance. Nevertheless, E5-2620 again is taking the first place, and E5-2690 is taking the last place. Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six Siege. This game is not very CPU demanding and you can play it on basically any CPU. Nevertheless, E5-2690 yet again delivers the worst performance. 205 and 250 FPS by minimal and averages, while E5-2620 V3 gives 231 and 281 FPS. More than 200 FPS will be more than enough even for the most demanding gamers, but still the difference is here. It's getting a bit too repetitive, but you also need to keep in mind that E5-2690 consumes significantly more electricity to deliver this level of performance. E5-2630L V3, as with many other games, just stays in between the two other CPUs. Metro Exodus. This is one more DirectX 12 API game. The game is rather demanding and not extremely optimized. Here all three CPUs are showing very comparable performance. E5-2620 yet again takes the first place, E5-2690 takes the last place, and E5-2630L V3 stays in between. 2690 gives 52 and 90 FPS by minimal and averages, 2620 V3 rises up the bar to 58 and 104 FPS. So by averages, the difference between these two CPUs is about 15 FPS. In my opinion, it's a rather big gap, especially if you keep in mind that E5-2620 V3 beats E5-2690 while consuming almost half as much electricity. The last game I'm going to take a look in this video is DCS World, or Digital Combat Simulator. The game is still using DirectX 11 API and is not very well optimized. Mostly it is using one or two CPU cores. Nevertheless, E5-2690, which has the highest CPU clock frequency and sometimes boosting up to 3.4 GHz, delivers the worst experience out of all three CPUs. 64 and 105 FPS by 1% low and averages. E5-2620 V3 delivers 71 and 116 FPS while consuming half as much power. E5-2630L V3 stays in between the other two CPUs once again. The difference between 2620 and 2630L V3 is rather insignificant. The game does not load multiple CPU cores, which lets E5-2630L V3 stay at its maximum CPU clock frequency of 2.9 GHz. Probably this helps the CPU to shrink the gap to 2620 V3. Now let's take a look at the combined results, combining all 18 tested games. On average, E5-2620 V3 delivers 71% FPS by minimals or 1% lows, and 116 FPS on average. E5-2630L V3 takes the second spot, 67 and 114 FPS, while E5-2690 takes the last spot with just 64 and 105 FPS. The performance difference might not be that big, but you also need to keep in mind the difference in power consumption. For those who do not trust MSI Afterburner readings about the CPU power consumption, I have also done some tests using my external watt meter to measure entire system power consumption. Using F1 2019 benchmark, entire system with the Xeon E5-2690 consumes about 270 to 290 Watt of electricity. The same configuration with E5-2620 V3 consumes only 230 to 250 Watt. If we switch to E5-2630 V3, power consumption drops by another 10 Watt, 220 to 240. Using Assassin's Creed Valhalla benchmark with E5-2690, electricity consumption jumps up to 360 to 380 Watt. With E5-2620 V3, electricity consumption is just 310–330 Watt, and E5-2630L V3 reduces power consumption by another 10 Watt, 300 to 320 Watt. As you can see, MSI Afterburner readings were fairly accurate, and the difference in power consumption between E5-2630L V3 and E5-2690 is about 40–50 Watt, depends on the workload. So, as you can see from the results, X79 platform with E5-2690 is still able to hold up with entry-level Xeon E5 V3 CPUs. Still, the performance is not as good as E5-2620 and E5-2630L V3, and to be able to deliver this performance, which is even not as good, E5-2690 is consuming almost twice as much electricity. This means more heat into your computer, and this also means a higher electricity bill. All in all, in my opinion, X79 platform should only be used for ultra-budget gaming or non-gaming computers, and if you have at least semi-decent budget, then you shall go to X79 E5-2620 or E5-2630L V3. Between these two CPUs, I would pick E5-2620 V3 simply because it has almost 400 MHz CPU frequency advantage compared to E5-2630L V3, but I was also positively surprised by E5-2630L V3, which was able to deliver very good performance for its money, even though the frequency is staying between 2.8–2.9 GHz. At the same time, if you already have E5-2689 or E5-2690 or E5-2650 V2, then there is no point to upgrade to E5-2620 V3 or E5-2630L V3. If you want to jump to the X99 platform from the X79 platform, then you need to get something like E5-2678 V3 or a CPU of the similar caliber. For now though, that's probably all I can tell you in this comparison. I hope you have enjoyed it, thanks for watching, thanks for listening, I hope it's gonna help you assemble your budget-friendly gaming computer. Goodbye.